Modern eMTBs can be amazing. Loads of power, loads of torque, long range. But without being comfortable, well, there's just no power without control. I think we can all agree that the wrong saddle can ruin a ride. So let's get to the bottom of comfort. We're going to be using Ergon saddles as they're our partner here on EMBN, and we're going to talk you through all the different options with saddles to make sure that you've got the perfect perch. We're going to cut through the hype to make sure that you are sitting comfortably. Now, before we dive into saddles, just a little favour, and that's if you can like and subscribe to the channel. It makes a really big difference to us here, and we can keep creating the great content just like this. I think everyone's got a pal that's found one saddle that rules all their bikes, and they'll try and convince you that this is the perfect perch. But saddles are personal, and what fits your pal might not fit you. But we've got 5 different factors on how a saddle fits, starting with what shape. Saddle shapes come in lots of variation, but we've got key forms. We've got flatter saddles and we've got more curved saddles. And which suits you is a really valid question. And a lot of it comes down to, well, you and your pelvis. Yes, the shape of your pelvis and specifically your sit bones and how and where they're shaped are going to mean that certain saddles are going to fit you better. One extra factor that you should consider is how flexible you are. So how tight your lower back is and how tight your hamstrings are. Why is this an impact? Well, if you're using a flat saddle and maybe you use that on a race bike when you're in great form, but now you've become a little bit more desk bound, it might be because your hamstring and lower back are really tight, and this limits how much your pelvis can rotate. So a more curved saddle is more supportive for those with a stiffer, tighter pelvis. The next factor is width of saddles. Yes, you might wonder why you need different widths of saddles, and that's, well, for performance. It's more comfortable to have your sit bones better supported. There's lots of science to show that people have different sit bone widths. You might have narrow hips, you might have wide sit bones, and the opposite is also true. The best way of finding out which saddle width option that you need is to sit on a measuring device. Lots of brands have different systems, whether it be crushy cardboard or soft gel, but it gives you a really good idea of what width saddle you need. The squidgiest, softest saddle is the best. No, actually, some of these saddles can be really quite firm but supportive. The science in how saddles work and how we need to support parts of your pelvis and then relieve pressure on soft tissue is well proven, and loads of saddles have grooves or cutouts, and well, they work, so I would recommend it. Padding doesn't have to be really plush. Sometimes you can get dual compound is the best description saddles, where you have softer sections but supportive firm sections where you get a much better damped ride. It is personal, but for e-bikes, some of these bigger saddles can work. Of course, you can ride a regular mountain bike saddle on an e-bike. There's nothing to stop you, but there's some solid reasons why an eMTB saddle can work. Okay, on the new wave of lighter, low torque, lightweight battery bikes, yeah, you could ride a regular saddle and it will be perfectly adequate. It'll work really well. But on the full power bikes, I've learnt through watching Jonesy and riding with Jonesy that these dedicated eMTB saddles have got some real advantages. Why? Well, on these big power, higher torque eMTBs, you can climb up some serious walls, but you've got to balance your control. You've got to balance where your weight is, and you've got to get that traction. And one of the ways in doing that is, well, staying seated much longer than you might imagine. But you've still got to work around that saddle and make sure you've got enough grip on the rear and you've got your weight forward enough that you don't almost loop out. So these dedicated eMTB saddles that are plusher throughout and have deeper support padding and also have a bit of a kicker on the back can really help with getting up those steep tech climbs on an eMTB. The final piece of the saddle puzzle. Well, there's quite a bit to go on. First, there's height, and setting the right height is key. We don't have to get roady nerdy and get to algorithms to work out a saddle height. You can use just a simple rule of thumb of your heel flat on the pedal with a little bit of a bend in your leg, or you can use the Le Mans method if you want. I think key though is a dropper post. Okay, it's not essential, by no means you can use a QR, but to get the most from your modern e-bike, a dropper post is hugely useful. And they're not that expensive anymore. I saw one from a fairly decent known brand for under 100 quid. So that's under 100 UK pounds. And it is really good. Why? Because on an e-bike, you can climb really steep stuff and you can cover terrain really quickly. And that terrain will change really quickly, and you need to change where your saddle height is. And it's not as simple as, say, with a downhill bike or a cross-country bike where you've got it up the most of the time or down. We're closer to enduro races where the saddle is going to be really dynamic in terms of height, especially climbing. We're going to want it just a little bit lower. Why? It's all about, well, like we said before, about climbing and managing our weight distribution. So that's one factor. The other factor is setting it up. Most saddles, and the ergon saddles I've got here, are pitched to be nose flat. So that means that you actually do get a bit of a kick on some of the models. Now, word of sort of, I guess, caution is if you've got front suspension or full suspension, that when you're setting your saddle angle nose flat, well, you've got to take into consideration sag. Why? Well, depending on how your sag is, whether it's level or whether it's sort of slightly uneven, which it often is where you have a little bit more sag on the rear of the bike, means that your saddle will end up either nose up or nose down uncomfortably. So it might take a couple of goes, but make sure your sag is set, then try your saddle, make sure it's nose flat. There's lots of pieces of the saddle puzzle, but hopefully these 5 or so tips have helped.